be, you have a question?
Oh, no,
Yes.
One family restaurant, and family.
Is it, okay,
And feminine.
so nuestras is plural and feminine because it modifies as ofensas. Okay, and which was the first one? Right below it, the, no, that's actually we, nosotros, as we
Oh,
forgive.
no, I'm sorry.
Okay, dado soy nuestro, masculine singular because it modifies by. So as an adjective, see, masculine singular, or feminine plural, us. We are,
We're good.
it's nice to have everyone here tonight. I'm going to be talking tonight about something I've talked about many times, but I'll come up with something new tonight, I promise. It's going to be about the Franciscans and other missionary groups. We're still following that first plan. Remember Rome, Hispano-Roman Spain, the Middle Ages, the Visigoths, Al-Andalus, then the Reconquista, and then we got up to the point of Columbus's first voyage, and now it's time to talk about the Spanish and their travels, right, to what we call, and some people call, the New World. The New World, right? What did people usually say in Spain to refer to what we call the New World? What term did they use? What was it? Actually, in the 16th century, for most of the early years, it was Indias. Indias. Un viaje a Indias. Indias is the why? Because really, from the beginning, it was thought that Columbus had gone to India, right? So that's where you get the term Indiano, Indias. Indiano means also from the New World. Indiano can mean from the New World. That's really in the early use of the term in the 16th century. That's what Indias is, the New World of Indiano. Oh, I love that man. I love that man. But you know, if you start thinking about it, it doesn't take any time for the monarchy, the representatives, the king, and so on, and his assistants to decide, look, if we're going to be going to this new place, then we need to be sending religious there so that we can take the opportunity to save souls. I know it sounds like I'm whitewashing this all. I am a little bit, but it's actually from a very early time, a very important initiative, which is part of the whole enterprise of going to the New World. Already in 1493, that date, 1493, the first missionaries, a couple missionaries, actually accompanied, who would they have accompanied in 1493? Columbus. This is actually already by the second voyage, right? There are already a couple of missionaries who go along with Columbus. Now, if you're thinking of missionaries and you're thinking of the early 16th century, late 15th century, right before the year 1500, what religious groups, what religious orders would you think of if you were thinking of missionary groups that would be coming to Indias, to the New World? What early 16th century? No, actually, you would not. Now, that was an excellent guess, and let me say something. If we move forward, the Jesuits are going to be coming in large numbers, but not until the second half of the 16th century. So I'm looking for a little earlier, because when were the Jesuits founded and by whom? The Jesuits were founded by Ignatius of Loyola. Ignacio de Loyola, which as we know is Spanish. We think of places like Montserrat, where he was, and so on. It's not until the 1540s, really, that we can talk about the Jesuits. And then, of course, their missionary activity takes off already by the second half of the 16th century. But if we think about those, let's think about some other religious communities that might have been missionaries in, let's say, the year 1500.
Dominican and Franciscan.
There were Dominicans. The Dominicans had already been established. Where were the Dominicans established? Does anyone know? Who's the founder of the Dominicans?
Saint Dominic.
Santo Domingo, right? It's it's actually, yes, Saint Dominic. Another group we might think of, in fact, a group that's more numerous at the time, that has more members, more houses. What group do you think I'm thinking of? The Franciscans, exactly. San Francisco. Who was San Francisco? I know I'm talking about, early exploration, early colonization, early missionary work, but who, just for the record, who was San Francisco? San Francesco. Was that his original name? Yes, Francis of Assisi. Or who can tell me what his original name was? Giuseppe. What do we know about his early life? That's right. He came from a rich family. He decided to give that all up and turn his life over to God. And let me say this. There were many, many, many people, even in his own lifetime, who were moved by him, by his life, by his example, by the way he lived. This is a nice image here of St. Francis. Notice he bears these marks, the marks of Jesus on the cross, right? The wounds on the hands, on the feet, and the side. What do we call that? When someone, the stigmata, exactly, the stigmata. Once I was in a history class, many years ago, before most of you were born. And this professor at the University of California, Berkeley, was saying, he was talking about the stigmata, and he says, well, I know that some of you are probably thinking, oh, yeah, no, that didn't happen. He said, actually, let me just, for the record, tell you something. There's way more historical evidence that St. Francis experienced the stigmata than there is for the Battle of Hastings. He said, there's almost nothing for the Battle of Hastings. Is that amazing? No one would ever doubt for a second that there's a Battle of Hastings. There's way more. Why would there be way more? And I think I'm asking a question here. Why would there be way more documentation for the stigmata of St. Francis? Yes. Because, what was that?
It's more surprising.
Well, it's not just that it's more surprising, yes.
Well, I guess it's also because, usually if there's something that's claimed to be like a big miracle that happens in the church, like it gets tested a lot. Like it's not something where the bishop is just going to be like, oh yeah, that happened.
That's an excellent answer.
He's going to send out doctors to see. Like if there's a miracle for a saint's canonization, they have to have very good medical evidence to prove that it actually was a miracle. It can't just be by hearsay.
Let me just say this. It's because it is such an amazing story, and because he was such an amazing person, that he was just amazing as a person who motivated people. In fact, before Saint Bonaventure in the Bonaventura in the 13th century put an end to biographies of Saint Francis, there were all these biographies of Saint Francis. Many, many, many. because that is actually one of the genres of literature that's most popular in the Middle Ages. It's called hagiography, hagiography, lives of saints. And there were many sort of biographers who didn't necessarily know the historical facts, but it didn't matter. They were writing like this legendary history of this person named Francesco, who became this amazing inspirational figure. There are many legends. I brought a couple books to pass around, which I'll pass out. Don't let me forget to pass these two books around later. I'm going to just tell you one of the legends of St. Francis. You say to me, oh, well, is it true? I don't know. Probably not. But it's a beautiful story. And the reason I want to tell it is because I just think the story is amazing. You know, some of you may know that St. Francis for a while was in prison, right? How many knew this? Yeah. And he was with a group of prisoners, hardcore people, and they gave them very little to eat, as you can imagine. You know, prisoners, who's going to waste food on that? And St. Francis, the story is told, would begin to give what little he had to the others. And slowly but surely, he had 1, 2, 3, 4 of his fellow inmates. He said, yes, I want to follow this man. And by the time he left, now the number is going to, you say, oh yeah, we did that. 12 inmates afterwards were devoted to him, committed to him, and 6 of them became Franciscans. Is that a remarkable story? That's the kind of person he was. And the Franciscans took off as an order, as a religious order. When I say took off, I mean they just grew fast. Very, very fast. It spread like wildfire. St. Francis was probably the first writer writing about him in Italian, maybe the first examples we have actually of written documents in Italian. He's that important in the history of Italy, and of course his legacy is amazing. And his legacy is amazing in the New World. The Franciscans were early on a part of this new whole effort of exploration, colonization, conquest. The Franciscans are there early on in the place we now call Mexico. Before that, they'd been in the Dominican Republic. They'd already been in Cuba, but they're in Mexico. In Mexico, a group, again, at number 12, it's probably right in this case. They're sometimes referred to as the 12 apostles. The first 12 Franciscans who go to Mexico have a tremendous impact. Those 12, what kinds of activities would they have been involved with in those early years between, let's say, 1522, 1527? What do you think they were doing? Pardon?
Evangelizing?
They're evangelizing, they're teaching, they're working very, very hard. One of the first things that let's say this, maybe not one of the very first things, but early on in the time the first Franciscans arrive in what is now Mexico, they actually built a school. And that school was called El Colegio de Tlatelolco. El Colegio de Tlatelolco is one of the most important contributions of the Franciscans. There at that school, they took in students who were actually they belonged to royal families among the Mexicas. They took in these, they built a church, of course, they built a school, and the noble families were by then having their children baptized. They were baptizing these children, and they built a school, and they started teaching catechism. An early obstacle for them would have been language. What did they do? They started preparing catechisms, only more than anything else, rather than in written script, with pictures. Wonderful start. They start off with pictures, images. Don't forget that early on, if you know the Mexica text, the Aztec codices and so on, they're all in glyphs. They're all in pictures. There's not a language that's written out phonetically. It's in images. It's in pictures, like so many other languages, early languages in the history of language. So the Spanish put together catechisms, and then slowly but surely they begin to produce catechisms written in Nahuatl. Written in Nahuatl. Why would they do that? Because beyond the pictures, they wanted to make sure that they could express doctrine. That's an excellent question. I mean, you probably, I'm surprised you would know about the Baltimore Catechism. But actually, I grew up on the Baltimore Catechism. The Baltimore Catechism was the standard catechism for people like me who grew up before Vatican II.
How do you know now?
Well, there are many ways, but N-A-H-U-A-T-L, Nahuatl. Nahuatl.
So that's what they're supposed to.
Some people leave off the TL, and some people refer to the Mexicas. The people I'm calling the Mexicas are what we usually call the Aztecs. I'll explain in a second why I use that term. The Mexicas are sometimes called the Nahuas. The Nahuas, one of the names for the Mexicas is the Nahuas. As in Nahuatl, their language, the Nahuas are the, but actually the term Aztec is not a term they use. It's not a term Cortés ever heard or ever used. Does anyone know where the term Aztec comes from? It comes much later from a German naturalist who was traveling through Spain, and he wrote a very, very important description of Spain, of the landscape, the geography, the peoples. His name was Alexander von Humboldt. Alexander von Humboldt was the first to use the term Aztecs, and here's how he got the term. He was talking to some people through a translator, and he said, "And where do you come from?" And they said, what's he asked? Aztlan. Aztlan. If you were a Chicano communist, you would know that's actually in East LA. But Aztlan is the place in the north where it is said the Aztecs came from. They came from Aztlan, so they were called Aztecs. That's actually from Humboldt. But the term became so important, so used, so overused, that the Mexican government adopted the term, and now all over Mexico, Estadio Azteca, Equipo Azteca. This brand, Azteca. Azteca is everywhere. It's after independence, of course. They want to go back to their native roots. They want to find themselves, and they named their new country in 1821 Mexico, which is from Nahuatl, which means the ombligo of the world. Mexico, 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 the ombligo of the world. That's the meaning of Mexico from the Mexicas. The Mexicas are actually the people we call the Aztecs. So I may have been confusing there, but already the Franciscans are learning this language called Nahuatl. Because the Mexicas were the most powerful of the native groups, their language was the lingua franca for Mesoamerica, for Middle America. Their language was the language of trade. It was the language of taxation. They taxed people all the way into Central America. The Mexicas ruled all that area, Mesoamerica.
May I ask how you spell Mexica?
Mexica, M-E-X-I-C-A, M-E-X-I-C-A, and I'm pronouncing the X as an S-H. Mexica. In fact, the early pronunciation for Mexico would be Mexico. Or Mexico, both could be used. Mexico.
Thank you.
From Mexico, like I said. So the Mexicas are learning now catechism from the Franciscans, and they're at Tlatelolco, which you can go there now. What's the name of the plaza where Tlatelolco is in Mexico City? Does anyone know? La Plaza de las Tres Culturas. La Plaza de las Tres Culturas. And it's called La Plaza de las Tres Culturas because, thank you, perfect, it has La Plaza de las Tres Culturas. I think your image before might have been a little better for my purposes.
Okay.
La Plaza, here we go. La Plaza de las Tres Culturas, because it has ruins from the central market of the Mexicas to the colonial church, which was built by the Franciscans, and 3, La Raza Cósmica, modern Mexico. La Plaza de las Tres Culturas, the plaza of the 3 cultures, the indigenous, Mexicas, Aztecs, the colonial, and then modern Mexico, where you can find these apartment buildings. You can walk to La Plaza de las Tres Culturas from Midtown, Mexico City. It's very close. I've walked there myself many times. I don't know how safe it is now, but it used to be safe. Plaza de las Tres Culturas, that church is very old. In fact, there's a legend, which may not be true, but it's a legend. One of the most famous people living in the early 16th century, was himself a baptized Christian. He took his original name was Cuautli, which means this: Cuautli, eagle, Tuatzin, the eagle who speaks. The eagle who speaks. Cuautli, he is now Saint Cuautli. What was his Christian name? His Christian name was Juan Diego. Juan Diego, as you know, from La Virgen de Guadalupe, right? Juan Diego, it is said, was baptized in that church. The church in the Plaza de las Tres Culturas, there's a baptismal font as you walk in, and the legend is because who has a photograph of this? There are no photographs, there are no pictures, there were no tape recorders, all the things that maybe some crazy anti-apparitionist would want, for proof. No, we're not going to find that kind of proof. It is said, though, that Juan Diego, can you get more Christian than that? How's that for a Christian name? When you're baptized, you take on a new name sometimes. I want to ask you this. What was St. Paul's name before he became in Greek? Paulus. Shaul. Saul. Shaul, why do you persecute me? The names change. When people enter religious life, often they change their names. And when one becomes the Roman pontiff, you take on a new name. So I want to ask this question. Okay, raise your hand if you've never answered a question. If you've never answered a question in this class, raise your hand. I'm going to ask someone. I'm going to ask you. Okay, here's the question. What name did the current Pope take when he became our current Pope? He took the name Francisco, the very name we're talking about. Isn't that interesting? He's a Jesuit, right? Bishop Bergoglio was an Italian who lived, of course, in Argentina. He's ethnically Italian. He was an Argentino. He lived in Buenos Aires, right? But he took on the name Francis. Why would he take on the name Francis? You know?
Francisco.
Why would he take on the name Francisco? Why did he take?
He wanted
Why
to
does
be-
he become
wants
Papa
to be
Francisco?
like him.
Let's ask Sister. Why does he
He's the
take on the
first
name
one.
Francisco?
Because he was inspired by his life in the service to the poor. St. Francis.
He was absolutely inspired by the life of St. Francis, and St. Francis also inspired the founder of the Jesuits, Ignacio de Loyola, who had a spiritual director who was a Franciscan.
Isn't
He
he
had
the first Pope Francis that was known
Yes.
as Pope Francis?
Yes.
There's only
yes,
one, and it's the current one,
Yes.
exactly, or it would be the second, third, fourth. This is the one. Francisco, he took on the name Francisco, even though he was a Jesuit, but that's the power of Francis. And the Franciscans are early, that's Ignacio de Loyola, Ignatius of Loyola. And of course, there were hundreds at first and then thousands of Jesuits in Mexico, but not until a little bit later. In that early age, it's the Franciscans, and they mostly, at the very beginning, they're around a place called, they're at a place called Tenochtitlan. What's the modern name for Tenochtitlan? Mexico City. Tenochtitlan in Spanish is pronounced Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan, but in Nahuatl it's Tenochtitlan. So there they are, near Tenochtitlan. They build this church, which is now the church that we see at the Plaza de las Tres Culturas. There, it is said, Juan Diego was baptized, but many, many, many other people are baptized there. They build a school which becomes a college. Early on, Colegio de Tlatelolco, and it is said that Juan Diego, the first day of the apparition, was on his way to visit people there at Tlatelolco. He was on his way there from his hometown, which is north of where this takes place. His hometown was a town called Cuautitlan. So if his name was Cuauhtlahuatzin, the eagle who speaks, what do you think the meaning of the word Cuautitlan is? The place of the eagles. The place of the eagles is where Juan Diego was from. The place of the eagles. You can still go there, by the way. Cuautitlan still exists. It's talked about at length already, or long before this, but I just wanted to bring a couple of books here to show you what some of the, these are modern editions of early texts that tell the story. It's called Historia Eclesiástica Indiana, and it's the ecclesiastical history of the work of the catechists and the work of the missionaries in Mexico. Historia Eclesiástica Indiana. Just want you to look at some of the names of the chapters. Very interesting reading. Our library actually has some wonderful books at OU about the early Franciscans, because this is something that's been studied a lot. Of course, the Franciscans aren't they're not the only group that goes. We have Dominicans mentioned earlier. In fact, in the state of Oaxaca, we have quite a number of huge mission churches that were later abandoned. Long story. We also have early on some from the community of St. Augustine, The Augustinians, lots of Augustinians. Early on, they begin coming after the Franciscans. Why so many? Because there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work to be done. The population of Tenochtitlan and the area around Tenochtitlan is huge. There are lots and lots of native peoples. What are the Spanish soldiers and conquerors doing at this time? They're building, they've decided that they don't like the way the capital city is designed. It's a series of little islands all connected by bridges. They take the bridges out and they drain the lakes and they start filling them in. Slowly but surely they fill them in and they say, we need to plant something here besides corn. What do they plant? This is a big point. Wheat. They say, we're going to plant wheat because we want bread. We want to plant wheat. But listen, here's a difference. I know nothing about this, but I've read about it. Here's the difference between corn and wheat. If you know about it, raise your hand. You can produce way more food on an acre of corn than you can an acre of wheat. There's way more. So it takes, the Spanish begin clearing land, right? They drain the lakes. They really change the whole landscape, and they start building a city, which will come now eventually to be Mexico City. And as we know, centuries later, year after year, generation after generation, there are problems because this was all built on a lake, right? In fact, if you remember, the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe used to be like this in the 1960s, that a new church was built. I think inaugurated in 1972, but all of that is a problem. There are some early images. Oh, these are great. Early images or reconstructed images of what this is actually, yes, Tenochtitlan, which is of course Mexico City now. There are temples all over the place. There are buildings. There's a central square. What do the Spanish typically do with the temples? Destroy them and often build a church on top, which is exactly what the Mexicas did, right? With the groups that they conquered. They level off the top and put their layer on top. This is an old tradition, as I think I said, with the Mezquita de Córdoba in Spain. It was first a Roman temple. We know that from the alabaster columns throughout. Then it becomes a Visigothic church. Then it becomes a mosque, the Mezquita de Córdoba, and then it becomes the Cathedral of Córdoba. One after another. Question.
I have a comment to make. In my county in Kansas, they're thinking about starting to grow hemp. You know?
Me too.
Well, thank you.
Well, it isn't strong like the marijuana, but anyway, they're gonna be better to grow it than try to weed and corn and milo.
Well, we know, as far as cash crops are concerned, we
Canada has legalized marijuana.
well, so does Oklahoma, just for the
I
record.
don't think.
Medical marijuana.
Well, I think that's what it's supposed to be in Canada, but it's what it's supposed to be in Colorado, but.
Yes, thank you very much. So as the different groups arrive, still another group arrives,
Under
the
the
Carmelites. Who are the Carmelites? Who are the Carmelites? Does anyone know?
I thought they were sisters.
First of all, where do they get their name?
From Mount Carmel.
From Mount Carmel, which is where?
In the Holy Land.
It's in the Holy Land. Mount Carmel, Monte Carmel, it's in the Holy Land. It's a symbol for many
holy. Los Carmelitas, los, plural masculine, los Carmelitas, even though it ends in as, los Carmelitas, these are also, this is another group, very important. They begin to build churches, and each of these groups also begins to have their own schools. The Franciscans were early on, they were the first, but then the Dominicans began to have schools. The first bishop of Mexico was a Franciscan. His name is Juan de Zumárraga. Juan de Zumárraga, friar. What does the word friar mean? From frater, brother. Frater in Latin, right? Brother. In French, frère. So it's Fray Juan de Zumárraga, the first bishop of Mexico, was a Franciscan. Early on, the second bishop is actually a bishop who's Dominican, Montúfar. Montúfar is actually very, very important in the whole history of Our Lady of Guadalupe. He's one of the early defenders we can recognize and document as an early defender, giving sermons defending Our Lady of Guadalupe and the site at Tepeyac as early as 1552. Very important. It's very important in the history of the apparition narrative. So, among the Carmelites, this is, I'm probably not doing a very good job of this, but I'm trying to tie this in with a very important feast day yesterday. Does anyone know what yesterday's feast day was? It was the feast of a Spanish saint named Saint Teresa, Santa Teresa de Avila, the most famous Carmelite of all. The most famous Carmelite. I know there have been other famous Carmelites. One was another Spanish religious writer, great poet. Some say the greatest Spanish poet. San Juan de la Cruz, St. John of the Cross, 16th century. But actually his teacher was St. Teresa of Avila. And I think that Ignacio has a tape he wants us to watch, but just 1 second. If you can move this back up. He wants you to see, if we can move it down, oh, there's the beginning of it. A famous prayer/poem written by Santa Teresa de Avila. It begins with the words, nada te turbe. Let nothing upset you. Nada te espante. Let nothing scare you. Todo se pasa. All things pass. Dios no se muda. God does not change. La paciencia todo lo alcanza. Patience. It reaches all things. Quien a Dios tiene, who has God, nada le falta, lacks nothing. Solo Dios basta. God alone is enough. So remember those words as you watch this. He's going to show us a short video about celebration of St. Teresa of Avila, whose saint's day was yesterday. I'll shut that off over there. Go ahead.
I am Sister Pia from Carmel of St. Joseph, Croatia.
Querida el niño Jesús, por
Sister Lucia from the Netherlands.
Sister Judy Long, United States.
Maria Elena, España.
Sœur Caroline, France.
Sister Raphael, Singapore.
Sister Lucas, the 5 Wheels, London, United Kingdom.
Sister Chloe,
All Carmelites.
Canada. Sister Augustine, Philippines.
To put some music to home.
what's fascinating about it is they're all in different places and it's all edited together to make it sound like it's a play.
She's saying
Okay, so this is gonna,
that's okay.
it's still a mind-blowing thing to watch this. That's a tricky person to be this.
I'm sorry we ran a little bit over on time, but we still have some food left for those who are hungry. And now you can find your teachers and get ready for part 2. Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Oh, that's fantastic. Great. Yes.
I know Lois.
Let's stand there.
Take care.
Establishing, put the family establishing. See, by the time they begin to